The story started with the familiar sound of teacups clinking and the subtle aroma of something about to burn, as many stories in St. Mildred's do. As usual, the Thursday afternoon sewing circle convened in the charming hour-ray drawing room of Mrs. Blackwood's cottage. The quaint ivy-clad home is nestled behind the vicarage and features lace curtains that quiver slightly whenever someone walks by. The ladies of the village had just taken their seats and were getting ready to stitch when a sharp voice from the adjacent kitchen proclaimed, "Elizabeth, your tart. Oh my goodness, the apricot tart." Mrs. Blackwood exclaimed, her voice carried away by a cacophony of rustling skirts, as she nearly knocked over the milk jug. As they looked at each other, the other women laughed. The topic of controlled amusement among the seated women was Mrs. Blackwood's ambitious, though not always successful, baking. Madame Marple, as she delicately moved her knitting needles. Her eyes, a mischievous shade of blue, absorbed the room's energy. Despite the normal cordial conversation, there was an air of tension today. Miss Wyford Clare, a newcomer from Eastbourne, had taken Mrs. Lydia Fernwell's seat. Mrs. Fernwell had arrived a few minutes late, paused at the sight, and smiled tightly before sitting across from her. It was the kind of moment that most people would forget by the time tea was poured, but Miss Marple, who rarely forgot anything from the kitchen, mumbled something about a tray falling and Lydia Fernwell's exasperated groan about having burned it again. Wyford was barely audible, but Lydia Fernwell had made her voice heard. Miss Marple's gaze darted lower as Claire silently smoothed the creases of her apron. It was a strange detail, but it mattered when Mrs. Blackwood came back, red-faced and complaining about unreliable oven knobs, and the room was unusually quiet. So she huffed, "There are store-bought scones instead, I'm afraid, and jam. Can you continue talking amongst yourselves?" As the topic of Arthur Banbury up during tea, Lydia's grin took on a bittersweet quality. "Did you hear he's back in the village?" Elizabeth asked, her voice filled with enthusiasm. After all those years in India, imagine several spoons paused mid-air, staying with his cousin. It was Winifred's voice that was too silky. Lydia Fernwell patted her mouth, asking to stay, but I hadn't invited him. Mrs. Fernwell, wasn't she? There was a brief pause in Miss Marple's knitting, and I suppose he isn't quite the scandal he was in 34. Lydia laid her cup down with extraordinary care, and Eliza immediately agreed, laughing. "That's true," Eliza added hurriedly. "Of course, that poor housemaid, what was her name?" Winifred asked, her eyes never leaving Lydia's. In that moment, Lydia's hand trembled slightly, her chair shifted nervously, and she shot a worried glance toward the sideboard. Miss Marple saw this, and the tension returned like a draught through a newly opened window. "A different pastry, Miss Marple." Elizabeth politely declined. "No, Miss Marple," replied gently though. "I must say there's something quite telling about the way people fold their aprons. Don't you think?" There was polite laughter, except from Lydia, whose lips pressed into a pale line as the afternoon waned and the ladies left in pairs or trios, chattering about the vicar's cat and the cost of sugar, miss. Marple lingered behind. She stood alone for a moment in the drawing room, her eyes resting on the chair Wyford had occupied, then shifting toward the sideboard. The faint scent of burnt apricot still lingered in the air. In the days to come, few would remember the tart that had nearly blackened, but all would remember the murder that followed, and Miss Marple, who had noticed that the apron had been folded wrong. Chapter 2. The news spread, as these things always did in St. Mildred's, not through announcements, but through lowered voices over fences, sidelong glances in the grocer's, and the shifting rhythm of the village itself. By mid-morning on Friday, The once trivial return of Arthur Banbury had taken on a sharper edge, not because he had done anything particularly scandalous since arriving, but because he had not been seen at all that morning, and because, though no one said it aloud, as Miss Marple strolled past the Fernwell cottage on her morning walk, she couldn't help but notice two things. First, that Mrs. Lydia Fernwell hadn't opened her curtains. Second, that she continued past the rose hedges of the vicarage and the corner, where the son of the grocer had left his bicycle propped awkwardly against the postbox. The air was thick with the scent of early blooms and something else, something more brittle. Finally, in front of the village shop, two women stood close together, arms folded tightly against the breeze. Their voices were low as they whispered that Lydia had a conversation with him the night before. Who knew a man could get into a fight over a rocking chair? Just outside the shop door, Miss Marple paused to straighten her glove, her expression impassive. "Do you think he's gone again?" No, because someone overheard Miss Marple yelling after midnight, and she sneaked into the shop, someone muttered. A small, well-dressed man entered the shop. Reverend Perkle Hartnell, the new curate, was earnest and seemed fresh-faced despite his thinning hair. He offered Miss Marple a polite smile before turning to Mr. Godfrey. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Is that a packet of embroidery needles again? Thank you. Maybe even a tin of that ginger tea you had last month." He cleared his throat awkwardly and continued, "Good morning. I just came from Mrs. Fernwell's. I was bringing the church bulletin." She didn't answer. Even though Mr. Godfrey continued moving forward unabated, the tension in the room hung heavy, as if it were static. "She is normally a morning person." I thought the Reverend was right when he said, "Miss Marple is very particular about her morning routine. And she has that gentleman visiting, doesn't she? Mr. Banbury's cousin, I believe." And Mr. Godfrey set the tea on the counter. "No," Miss Marple whispered, "he never was." An anxious stillness descended upon the room as the doorbell rang once more. It was young, with a red face and a fist clasped to her hand. Marjorie Denton exploded. "They've called the constable down at the Fernwell place." They found Marjorie. They discovered something in the rose bushes behind the cottage, but it's silent now. The gardener noticed it this morning, and Constable Reeves is already there. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but authoritative. Dear Marjorie blinked, apologizing. Miss Marple's remained perfectly composed as she reached for her coin purse and spoke the words, "That will be all. Thank you, Mr. Godfrey." By noon, the village had moved purposefully outside. The path near the Fernwell garden had been roped off, not officially, but with the social authority of the gathering crowd and Reeves' uniform. The constable, who was red-faced and struggling to maintain control, raised a hand as the vice-president approached. "Please, Reverend, I'd rather not have anyone else disturbing the area." "Mrs. Fernwell is in quite a state?" the vicar asked. Reeves glanced around before answering. "I found something odd this morning. A handkerchief with ripped blood on it, and there was no sign of Mr. Banbury's bed. I didn't sleep in his bed. I don't know how he got out of his locked room." "Reverend," Hartnell whispered, "how could he leave?" "Well, that's the thing, isn't it?" Reeves asked with an uneasy expression. With her hands delicately clasped around her parasol, Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes observing every movement. Reeves, visibly anxious, nervously tapped his notebook, while the vicar peered at the house's side entrance. Marjorie, concealed behind the garden gate, nervously bit her thumbnail. Despite the apparent tranquility of the village, it was all a stage, and today the play had begun. "Did anyone see him leave?" inquired Mr. Godfrey, who had joined the increasing crowd of villagers. No one had seen him depart. Reeves replied, But he's not inside, and there's blood, not a body, not yet, but the breath beneath the surface of the village had changed. Miss Marple stepped back, her gaze lingered on the rose bushes. One of the lower branches had snapped not recently, but not long ago either, and by the base of the bush, a faint dark patch in the soil. It hadn't rained in 2 days. She turned. I do think she murmured to no one in particular that Mr. Banbury may not have left at all. Chapter 3. By the time the sun dipped behind the hedgerows, that evening the Fernwell garden had been declared off limits by Constable Reeves, though that meant little to the neighbours from the upper rooms of several cottages. Curtains shifted with discreet regularity. Miss Marple, however, made no further inquiries that day. She remained indoors at Hillside Cottage, the fire lit low in the grate, and her knitting in hand. Though her needles moved slower than usual, she had spent the afternoon sorting her thoughts, placing each observation like a stitch in her pattern: a torn, bloodied handkerchief in a rosebush, a bed not slept in, a bolted door. A vanished man by morning. St. Mildred's had reshaped the mystery to suit its rhythms at the baker's. It was a case of a jealous quarrel gone wrong at the inn. It was whispered that Banbury had finally crossed the wrong person, and at the church the Reverend Hartle prayed rather pointedly for those whose secrets threatened to destroy their souls. But Miss Marple knew that truth, like embroidery, revealed itself only when one stepped back and viewed the pattern from a distance. It wasn't until midday, when the sky had turned an expectant grey, that Reeves appeared at Hillside Cottage. He removed his hat awkwardly. Miss Marple, might I trouble you for a moment? Of course, Constable, do come in. I've just set out tea. Reeves declined the offer of refreshment, hovering instead in the entryway like a man uncomfortable in stillness. We've searched the Fernwell house top to bottom, he said. No sign of Mr. Banbury, but he hesitated. We did find something tucked in the back of the pantry, behind the flour tins, a set of cufflinks engraved Arthur Banab. Yes, one of them's cracked, as if it hit something hard. We also found a smear of blood on the back. Pantry door faint but there, and the back gate locked from the inside. Miss Marple gave a slow nod. Then either someone was very thorough or very frightened. Reeves looked pained. Mrs. Fernwell insists she went to bed early, heard nothing, claims she found the front room empty in the morning, and assumed he'd stepped out. But she was pale as chalk, pale but composed. He blinked. Yes, that's just it. She was shaken, but not how do I say, grieving, not even surprised. Miss Marple folded her hands. Did you ask her when she last saw him? She said supper around 8. Said he retired early. She claimed she retired too, yet someone was heard shouting after midnight. Miss Marple said quietly. Reeves fidgeted with the brim of his hat. We've no proof it was them. Could have been anyone, but few in the village have reason to raise their voices after dark, she replied, and even fewer would be arguing with Arthur Banbury. He nodded. We've taken a statement from the gardener. He's the one who found the handkerchief. Mr. Wickies has been in a committed relationship with Mrs. Fernwell for quite some time. Yesterday morning, while trimming, he noticed something white beneath a bush. He didn't touch anything, but he did phone me immediately. He claimed to have been home the night before, though he did appear anxious. Miss Constable Marple inquired after a little pause, was there any indication that the cufflink had been trodden upon? When she cast her eyes toward the window, a crow perched on the garden wall, studying the ivy below. I don't think Lydia Fernwell did it, do you, miss? He shifted his weight and scowled. The jewelry had a dent on one side, as if caught beneath a boot. I suspect it fell during a struggle. The pantry isn't the best location for jewelry to fall. With a little bend of her head, Marple, Olivia Fernwell's intelligence makes her unfit to pull off a fake abduction. Clumsily, I have a feeling there won't be any blood, no handkerchief, and no cufflinks if she's guilty. After receiving a hurriedly written explanation that Arthur had returned to London, Reeves appeared to be a mix of relieved and unsure. Suddenly, another individual, even though it was more for the sake of ritual than pleasure. The stitching circle reassembled that evening, as if someone had meant for the town to take note of their absence. The normally boisterous atmosphere was muted, and the sound of needles clicking gently had taken their place. Winifred Lydia expressed her regrets by not attending, while Claire remained seated in the same spot as previously. Whitford straightened her skirt as Eliza said, "The whole affair has quite unnerved me." She and Arthur had unfinished business. And the old guard in business says that every argument is like a ton of bricks. As Wyford turned to her, Miss Marple whispered, "Do you think he's dead?" The room went silent, although arguments rarely end in tragedy. Miss Marple lifted her eyes from her knitting, her voice soft and soothing. "I believe that we would have heard from Mr. Banbury by now if he were well." As we stood outdoors, the wind fluttered around the roses. Somewhere in the village, someone was wishing they had buried the cufflinks deeper. Chapter 4. Saturday morning. Suspicion had grown as strong as the rhododendrons behind the churchyard wall. The ever-creative village had moved its focus from Lydia Fernwell to Mr. Wicks, the gardener who was seldom seen but widely speculated about. Several noted that he was a solitary sort, which in village terms meant suspicious. Hadn't he once spent a year hiding under unpleasant circumstances, the nature of which nobody could quite recall, but which were likely serious constable duties? By mid-morning, Reeves had gone to Wicks's cottage behind the tool shed, looked encouraged by the noise, and returned with one muddy boot and a coat with a little reddish smear on the sleeve. This matched the stain on the pantry door. Reeves declared to the vicar, who had been drawn into the investigation despite a complete lack of desire. Reverend Hartnell nodded with the sort of gravity the clergy are trained to summon when death and scandal intertwine. And did he explain? "It claims he scraped his arm on a rose thorn while pruning, which he does daily," said Miss Marple, who had been invited by the vicar, albeit reluctantly, to sit in on the conversation. Reeves frowned. "You doubt it, miss. I doubt only that such a routine injury would leave so neat a smear on such an inconvenient location." She said gently, "One doesn't generally elevate one's arm that high when tending a rosebed." "Well, he's got no alibi," Reeves said, "and he was the one who found the handkerchief, which, if he were guilty, would have been remarkably foolish," she noted. Hartnell interjected delicately, "He is a man of simple habits." Might not have considered that Miss Marple's expression remained placid. Even simple men are careful when frightened, and Wicky's, though quiet, is not unthinking. "I believe he did see something that morning, perhaps even before he found the handkerchief, but he's withholding it," Reeves grunted. "And why would he do that?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "That constable is the right question." That afternoon, Mrs. Blackwood made an unexpected visit to Hillside Cottage. She arrived breathless and pink-cheeked despite the mild weather. "Jane," she said, for she was one of the few who called Miss Marple by her first name, "I must say something. I know we're all meant to let Reeves sort it, but well, Winifred Clare." Miss Marple offered a chair and poured tea before saying, "Yes, she knew Arthur Banbury years ago, not just vaguely, not just from a garden party, she knew him." Before reaching her saucer, Miss Marple's fingers froze, and she said, "Go on." Eliza leaned forward. "Years back, oh, before the scandal with Rose, the housemaid, they say, Arthur went to Brighton for a spell, and so did Winterfred at the very same time. People thought nothing of it then, but well, it does make one wonder. She moved Eastbourne shortly after, and no one saw her again until she arrived here this year." Miss Marple nodded slowly, "And yet she mentioned Rose by name at our last meeting. That struck me as unusually specific." "Exactly," said Eliza. "She pretended she barely knew Arthur, but I think she knew exactly who he was." Miss Marple sat back, her gaze turning inward. "Have you noticed how frequently Wyford deflects questions by changing the subject. She does always in the middle of a sentence, as if she's remembered something urgent about teacups or curtains. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, it's an old technique, particularly useful when one has a past to erase later. That evening, a light drizzle began to fall, fine and persistent. The village square shimmered under the lamplight as Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage. She wasn't expected, but she often wasn't. She found Reverend Hartnell alone in his study, his sermon notes abandoned in favor of a small open letter on the desk. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said. He stood, startled. Not at all, Miss Marple. I was just reviewing something left in the church box. She reached for the document and asked, may I? The missing man did not leave. You were all watching the wrong gardener. He gave it over after he hesitated. The brief was typed but not signed. According to Miss Marple's 2 readings, there is just one gardener. Hartnell hesitantly agreed, but Miss Marple's detached expression suggested that the note was either written by an idiot or someone deliberately trying to draw our attention away from the fact that she had folded and returned the letter before leaving the vicarage. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, a blood-stained coat, a muddy boot, and a woman who folded her apron like a servant. Miss Marple wasn't yet prepared to identify the murderer, but she knew this. The village was much more complicated than anyone had suspected. Someone was carefully laying the groundwork, dropping hints here and there, but never quite enough to convict. The question wasn't who had the most to hide, but who knew just what to reveal. Chapter 5. Sunday morning brought a chill that seeped through the stone walls and settled into the corners of the drawing rooms in St. Mildred's. The villagers paid closer attention than usual, not to the sermon, but to each other, their gazes darting across the pews. Once again, Wyford was without Lydia Fennell. After the service, polite murmurs filled the churchyard as the Reverend Hartnell lingered longer than usual beside the stone archway, accepting greetings with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Claire sat 2 rows back, hands neatly folded in her lap, head bowed at every hymn, but her lips barely moved. Mr. Wickies, in an unusual turn of events, had shaved and polished his boots. Miss Marple, in her usual seat near the aisle, observed everything in quiet. As they strolled toward the lych gate, Elizabeth informed me that the Fernwell maid had gone to reside with her cousin in Dennington. Miss Marple casually mentioned that yes, Mrs. Fernwell had gently dismissed her yesterday. It was strangely timed, I thought. Miss Marple whispered just when one would expect her to want a complete family. She stated the girl was jittery and had begun hallucinating things. Did Miss Marple mention what kinds of things? Hartnell glanced at her, then away, only that she thought she saw someone outside the window on Thursday night, around midnight, before or after the shouting. She wasn't sure. Miss Marple nodded slowly, letting the breeze tug gently at the edge of her scarf. It was later that afternoon, while pruning her own rose bushes, that she noticed something unusual. It wasn't the roses, those were healthy and well-behaved. No, it was the string. She had wrapped a length of twine around the base of a particularly stubborn branch the week prior to guide its growth. Now, looking at it again, she saw the faint imprint of pressure where the string had bitten slightly into the bark. It reminded her, oddly, of something from the Fernwell garden. That night she wrote a single sentence in her notebook: why fold an apron? Like a maid unless one once was a maid. Monday brought rain and the return of Lydia Fernwell. Publicly, at least, she appeared at the grocer's around 10, pale but composed. I do wish the constable would find something, she said to Mrs. Blackwood, as she inspected a jar of marmalade. This lingering uncertainty is dreadful. While quietly noting the path, Miss Marple picked apples nearby and remained silent. Lydia's tone was too measured, without conviction. Mrs. William, just as Lydia politely nodded. Claire stepped in, her umbrella dripping and her countenance unreadable. I understand they've searched the footpath to the marsh, she added, meaning that because they hadn't found a footprint, he must have left some other way, should he? Lydia asked. Without waiting for a response, Wyford continued. Shortly after, Miss Marple went to visit Constable Reeves, who appeared exhausted with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a small front room covered in notes. She asked to look at the cufflinks again, and he blinked and said, "You think we missed something?" Marple then followed suit. "I think sometimes it's not what's on the object that matters, but what's not." On the table, he set the evidence tin, which contained 2 gold cufflinks, one with a small crack at the edge, and the other in perfect condition. Miss Marple studied them in quiet before smiling and saying, "Look at the back." Reeves leaned in closer, and she pointed out that, aside from the crack, they were spotless. There was no dirt or wear on the edges, leading her to suspect that they had been planted. Marple believed that they had once belonged to him, but she didn't think he brought them with him. Someone else had them, and they wanted us to find them. But there was a problem. It appears that the shattered cufflink was struck by a hard, sharp surface, as suggested by Miss Marple's tapping. However, Mr. Wicks's pantry has hardwood planks, so I presume it was damaged before being placed there. Whoever planted it probably didn't notice how ancient and pristine it looked. Seems like someone is trying to frame the gardener, or at least Reeves sunk into his chair. Maybe they were hoping to shift suspicion from someone else. Reeves blew out his nose. "I am completely baffled by this." Miss Marple stood then. "Perhaps it's time we asked ourselves not who stood to gain from Arthur Banbury's disappearance, but who feared his return most outside." The rain had stopped. A cool wind swept down the lane and in the garden behind Lydia. Fernwell's house, the broken branch on the rosebush, had begun to wither it. Snapped wood, already greying, no one had bothered to prune it, but Miss Marple would. She always did. Chapter 6. Tuesday morning. The mood in St. Mildred's had curdled. The rain had cleared, but the village remained overcast in tone conversations. Quieter eyes, more watchful. The mystery of Arthur Banbury's disappearance no longer stirred idle curiosity. It had begun to make people nervous. Something unspoken hung in the air now, like the scent of overripe fruit. It was Mrs. Blackwood who broke the pattern first. She arrived at Hillside Cottage mid-morning, not with tea cakes or idle gossip, but with something close to confession. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she began, perching at the edge of Miss Marple's floral armchair, "but I think you ought to know about wife." The patient Miss Marple informed me that she had been a governess for a family in Kent before moving to Eastbourne. However, when I brought this up with Mavis, Eddings, her sister, lives in Tunbridge, she said that no record of a Winter Fred Clare working for any family in Tunbridge under that name exists, which implies Mrs. Marple whispered softly that it may not be her real name. "I thought perhaps she was ashamed of something," she said quietly. "But now with all this going on, she could be hiding from more than shame." Later that day, Miss Marple finished quietly as she walked to Fernwell House. The shutters on the east-facing windows remained stubbornly closed. Instead of going to the front door, she circled the lane and paused by the garden gate. By then, something else had caught her attention, an imprint of a faint but unmistakable heel beside the flower bed. It was too large for Lydia and too square to be a man's print. This was discovered recently at the cottage. Someone came back to the scene that night, maybe to get something they had forgotten, or to make sure it stayed hidden. That evening, Miss Marple was invited to a private tea, but she suspected it was more of a calculated move by Wyford Clare. The sitting room was spotless. with books arranged by size, flowers arranged not only by color but also by height. It felt staged, and I thought we might have a private conversation. Wyford poured tea with a steady hand, and she said, "You've been quite involved in all this. I imagine you've formed your own theories. I think it's best not to form them too early." Mildly, Miss Marple responded, "People aren't always predictable, even when we're in the same room. For example," Wyford flashed a wan smile, "rumor has it that some of the villagers think I knew Arthur better than I'd let on." After a brief period of moving in the same circles, Miss Marple said, simply and due a pause, "People frequently filled the resulting void. If you're looking for an example of a man who thought the laws didn't apply to him, go no farther than Wyford. He was both seductive and dangerous, and he wrecked the prospects of more than one young woman. Some even claim Rose, the maid, was one of them." Wyford glanced squarely at the sorcerer when her teacup clicked gently against his. "She wasn't the only one. Did you depart because of him?" "I departed because I no longer felt secure." The window pane was rocked by a sudden burst of wind. Before Arthur returned, Wilfred's eyes didn't flit, and he never saw me here. Maybe not, but people like Arthur Banbury remember women with good reason to despise them for the first time. Miss Marple studied her guest, and the story had the shape of truth, but lacked the ring. There were edges, missing details shaved down to neatness. I wonder what she said next. Winifred seemed anxious. "Miss Marple, are you claiming that I am guilty of something?" "No, I don't think so," she responded gently, "but I do believe you've worked pretty hard to remain unseen." As she sipped her tea, she realized that occasionally people's attempts to disappear leave more visible outlines than if they had remained in the light. She stepped into the cool dusk, standing and thanking everyone for a lovely afternoon. Just before dawn on Wednesday, the vicarage bell rang twice sharply and then again, as if the visitor had changed their mind. Reverend Hartnell, who had been restless the night before, woke up and padded down the steps in her slippers and threadbare robe to find Constable Reeves on the doorstep, rain clinging to the brim of his hat. This led Miss Marple to suspect that Wyford Clare was hiding something, but she couldn't be sure it was murder. In this growing chasm, the truth would soon begin to emerge. At the Fernwell residence, Reeves spoke in a low voice about another event involving a broken window, a pried-open kitchen door, and something left behind. This time, the vicar rubbed his eyes not because of a body, I hope, but because of something quite as damning. A half-dozen Lydia Fernwell stood rigidly near the hearth, arms crossed, hair unpinned, and shadowed beneath her eyes. "I didn't hear a thing," she said tightly. "I came down for tea and found it like this." As Miss Marple stood in Lydia's kitchen, the aroma of dampache and linseed oil lingered in the air, a result of the rain that had poured in through the broken window before Reeves' arrival. "Nothing stolen?" Reeves inquired. "No signs of anybody being in here, but I detect a presence." As she knelt by the doorway, Miss Marple delicately raised a water-stained letter that lay curled up against the baseboard, her fingertips running along its edge. "Could I?" Lydia nodded briefly. Within, there was a single, somewhat illegible sheet of paper. No name, no signatures. Some ghosts don't remain buried, and Reeves read it over her shoulder. "You should have stayed quiet." Miss Marple ran her fingertips along the bottom edge of the thick, expensive stationery, which was not common in the area. The tear was jagged, as if pulled quickly off a pad. She questioned, when was it found? "At around 5:30, Lydia claimed." The bolt was still drawn from the inside when Reeves reported the kitchen door was pushed and shattered. Hence, they didn't enter that way. As Miss Marple whispered, they departed that way, too. Lydia was surprised, and Miss Marple stood slowly afterward. The scullery window, the one behind the ivy, is narrow but could be managed by someone thin. I think they were in the house before you went to bed, Lydia paused, and they waited all night. It seems like the note was meant to frighten someone else, not you, Mrs. Fernwell. Word had spread through the village, as usual, by mid-morning, but this time the tone was different worry, not gossip. Mrs. Blackwood locked her back door for the first time in years, keeping young Marjorie Denton indoors, while Wyford Clare, though silent, kept peering over her shoulder as she walked through the green. At Reeves' humble office above the post, Miss Marple was presented with a thin folder containing a response from London regarding Winifred Clare. Inside were 2 pages, Reeves explained, confirming her employment as a living companion under her maiden name, Wyford Yates, for a Mrs. Armstrong in Brighton. The other was a police report. She filed an accusation against Arthur Banbury in 1934. Silently assault withdrawn within the week, likely under pressure, Miss Marple said, scanning the lines. I suspect not the only one. Reeves frowned. Still, doesn't explain the break-in. Miss Marple tapped the report, and it does seem to indicate that Banbury may have kept something, letters, threats, proof of what he'd done, and that someone now believes Lydia has it. Miss Marple slowly nodded in agreement. The break-in wasn't random, it was desperate. Whoever broke into Lydia's house last night wasn't out to harm her. Rather, they were trying to erase the past. As Marple stood there, tucking the paper into its folder, she could tell that the people inside were desperate. The ones who mess up are the constables. Friday evening, at the stroke of dusk, a stranger came to Miss Marple's cottage, his cap clutched in both hands. I didn't know where else to go, he said. Come inside, Mr. Wickses, she murmured, standing aside, the kettle's just boiled. He stayed standing. I saw something the morning. I found the handkerchief. I didn't want to become involved, but I worry I've made it worse by saying nothing, miss. Marple's gaze intensified, but her voice remained kind. What did you see? I was in the garden just after dawn. I saw someone leave the house. Not Arthur, a woman, could you see, who knows she had a scarf pulled up. But she moved like she knew the place, knew where not to step, light on her feet, didn't even disturb the gravel. He hesitated, but I caught one thing, a brooch pinned to her coat. What kind of brooch? Swallowed silver in the shape of a lily, miss. Marple's eyes didn't flicker. She had seen that brooch before, worn only once at the Thursday sewing circle, pinned just above Wyford Clare's carefully folded apron. Chapter 8. Thursday dawned crisp and unusually still, the kind of morning that felt like the village was holding its breath. The sky, a dull pewter, hung low over the thatched roofs, and a faint mist curled along the hedgerows, never one to waste time. Miss Marple spent her morning rearranging the teacups in her cabinet. It was a leisurely activity that didn't really matter, but it allowed her mind to wander. Now she had nearly proven it. Wyford Clare had entered the Fernwell house the night Arthur Banbury went missing. Wickes had seen her with the brooch, so it was confirmed. But why confront Arthur, kill him, and retrieve something that might reveal her past? There were too many questions, and the answers seemed to be just around the corner. She needed one last move, though. Miss Marple invited a small group of women to tea with Lydia Fernwell that afternoon, posing as a social gathering rather than an accusation or confrontation. Clare, Wyford, and Blackwood, Mrs. It was a meticulously staged production of the Type A sunny room with a well-polished table and the aroma of lemon sponge wafted through the air as Miss Marple delicately poured tea for herself and the others as they settled in. Wyford wore a more understated outfit than usual and opted not to wear a brooch. Lydia appeared to be in a teaching mood, her eyes darting frequently toward the window. Elizabeth, bless her heart, appeared anxious. I found a scrap of linen folded rather strangely beside the lavender bed, Miss Marple observed as she delicately laid the teapot down. It was something I hadn't noticed before. Lydia arched an eyebrow in surprise. The object in question appeared to be a piece of fabric that had been ripped at the seam and folded inward, resembling an old apron. As she took a sip of her tea, the object brought to mind Wilfrid's folding technique. Wilfrid's hand paused over her saucer as she explained, "I suppose I do fold things the old way. Really, one never forgets the things they learn in service." Lydia blinked in surprise, and Wyford responded calmly, "Yes, I was a companion long before Eastbourne." Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly in curiosity. Miss Marple mumbled, "I suppose it's not uncommon to miss such information when presenting oneself, but that habit did jump out to me. You see most ladies in St. Mildred's fold aprons outward, don't they?" "Hello, Lydia." Lydia's nod was delayed. "It's the typical method, and yet someone entered your home the night Arthur went," Miss Marple continued, "and left behind a folded apron in your washing basket, an unfamiliar one, starched, pressed, frayed little." At the corner the silence deepened. Wyford set her cup down and asked, "Miss Marple, what precisely are you proposing?" "Oh, nothing. Only that habits are intriguing things. They expose us when we intend to remain hidden," she said with a nice smile. Subsequent pause. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," Winifred said gently, "but before you go, maybe you could retrieve the brooch that Winifred frozen, the one with the lily shape. It fell after you left the room, I imagine," and Miss Marple spoke gently. The next morning, after breakfast, Mr. Wicks discovered it under the trellis beside the kitchen wall. Wyford said, "I didn't kill him." Miss Marple stated, "I believe you, however you were present." "Yes," Winifred whispered, lowering herself back into the chair. "I went to speak to him. I needed to know if he still had them, the letters from before. I was terrified he might show them to someone, use them, but when I arrived he was already bleeding." Lydia's voice cracked. "Already?" Wyford nodded. "He was slumped in the pantry, breathing but faint. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I heard a sound upstairs and fled. I didn't think anyone had seen me." Miss Marple's voice dipped below a whisper as she asked, "Why didn't you call for help?" "I was afraid Lydia would be exposed." Lydia's complexion turned pale, and someone else had entered the house. Miss Marple nodded, saying, "Mrs. Fernwell, we must determine that the note left during the break-in wasn't written in panic. It was deliberate. Someone wants to scare you into silence. The question is why?" With that, she turned calmly to Elisa Blackwood, saying, "You were the only one who knew where Lydia kept her keys. You helped organize the sewing circle tea just before Banber's return. You also insisted that he had been in Brighton at the same time as Winter." Eliza blinked quickly as she spoke. The tea had long since cooled, and the table, once a symbol of civility, now seemed to hold only the fragments of carefully hidden secrets. The atmosphere in Miss Marple's drawing room was thick with tension, as the weight of unspoken truths pressed down on every chair. I wonder if Arthur Banbury had more than one secret buried in St. Mildred's, and whose reputation he truly threatened. However, she said no more at this point. Chapter 9 began. Mrs. William Elizabeth Blackwood, who had been the most composed of the group, appeared as though she had abruptly lost her footing as Lydia Fernwell became unusually silent. her face remaining pale, but her eyes darting back and forth as though seeking an escape. Claire sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, and a pale sheen of perspiration across her forehead betrayed the composure she had worked so hard to preserve. As if on cue, Miss Marple returned her teacup to its saucer with extreme care, the sound of the chinaware clinking louder than it should have been because someone in this room knew about the letters. At last, the pieces of the puzzle had come together, and she had suspected from the start that one of them was covering up something much larger than a simple argument or lost letter. For someone who drew anxiety from Arthur Banbury's return, not from the man himself, but from the power he wielded over them, Miss Marple's voice, though composed, bore the weight of truth. The truth started to crystallize in the elongated silence between Lydia and Eliza as Lydia shifted in her seat, a slight tremor coursing through her hands as she clasped them together. Miss Marple chose not to respond right away, instead fixing her gaze on Eliza. "Eliza, you've been protecting more than just Lydia, you've been protecting yourself," Miss Marple whispered. Lydia, who was still uncertain about speaking up or not, stared at Eliza in bewilderment and terror, asking, "What does this mean? What are you trying to say?" Eliza's jaw clenched in disbelief. Lydia had earlier told the village that Arthur Banbury had disappeared years ago and that the story had no further substance, but she had been lying. Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on hers as she knew exactly what Banbury was capable of. "It means," Miss Marple said, leaning forward, "that Arthur Banbury was not just some man from the past, he was your past. Eliza, he had your letters you wrote to him years ago once. You thought no one would ever read." Eliza's face drained of color. The words seemed to choke her, as if she had been holding them in all this time, too terrified to admit their truth. "No, you don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't like that, wasn't it?" Miss Marple pressed. "You were once his mistress, weren't you, Eliza, and when he threatened to expose you to ruin your life, you did what any desperate woman might do. You erased him. You made him disappear, and when he returned to St. Mildred's, you knew you had no choice but to silence him." The revelation hung in the air, its weight pressing down on Eliza until her composure shattered like glass. She turned away, unable to meet anyone's gaze. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I just couldn't bear the thought of him telling anyone." Her voice trembled with the burden of guilt, "but when I found out he still had those letters, I panicked. I went to his house to take them back. I didn't mean to kill him." Miss Marple gave her a moment to compose herself before continuing, her voice almost gentle now. "You were there that night, weren't you, as Lydia and Mr. Banbury got into an argument? Eliza entered the house and saw him struggling in the pantry. In your panic, you pushed him too hard, causing him to fall and hit his head on the corner of the counter. You then fled the scene, but you left behind clues such as a bloody handkerchief, a cufflink, and a twisted expression on Elizabeth's face. I didn't know what to do. Just because I stepped away from the situation didn't mean it would magically disappear. You attempted to conceal your actions, but the truth always finds a way to surface, as Miss Marple subtly pointed out. You believed you were shielding yourself from your history, but in reality, all you were doing was protecting it. It was you the whole time. I should have known about the lies and the quiet. How could I have missed it?" Lydia sat back, her voice quivering as she spoke. Her words came out more as accusations than questions, and Elizabeth looked at Lydia with a mix of shame and remorse. "I never meant to damage you, Lydia. I never meant for this to happen. But I couldn't let him destroy everything I've worked for. I thought if I could keep him away from you and the village." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "It's awful how fear can drive us to do horrible things, but in the end, all that matters is telling the truth as Miss Marple stood and her expression softened. She then looked over to Reeves, the constable who had stayed mute during the whole argument. "I think we found the solution." Reeves nodded, his face showing determination. "I will contact the London constables, who will apprehend her, but not before he leaves." As the room's illumination dwindled, Miss Marple turned her attention back to Eliza, her voice a mix of kindness and firmness. "You've done terrible things, Eliza, but there is still a chance for you to make amends, not with the village, but with yourself." The words lingered in the air as the last pieces of the puzzle came together. The truth had been revealed through careful observation and reasoning rather than force, and as the room's light dwindled, Miss Marple knew that justice would ultimately prevail. However, as she watched Eliza's defeated figure, an unspoken understanding between them suggested that some truths were more difficult to bear than others, and that living with what had been done was sometimes the hardest of all. Miss Marple cast a glance out the window, where she could see the village returning to its peaceful, unassuming ways. But the following days in St. Mildred's were marked by an unsettling calm. The villagers had slowly returned to their routines, but there was a faint tension in the air, a quiet understanding that some things were never quite as they seemed. The garden competition went on as planned, though the chatter was noticeably more subdued, and Lydia Fernwell no longer made casual trips to the market. She had returned to her home, but the sense of isolation that clung to her now seemed more pronounced, as if she had retreated, not just from the village, but from herself. Winifred Clare, too, was absent from the daily gatherings. Miss Marple had expected as much. There were few places for her to hide in a village like this, and she had no desire to be seen. Her silence, however, did not mask the guilt that lingered in the corners of the village, guilt that Miss Marple knew would follow. Winter fled for some time, but it was Eliza Blackwood who lingered most heavily on Miss Marple's thoughts after the confrontation. Eliza had been taken to the station for questioning, and though she had offered a confession of sorts, Miss Marple was certain it wasn't all. There were pieces of the story that still didn't add up: the motive, the means, and the final twist of fate that had led to Arthur Banbury's death. The evening following Eliza's arrest, Miss Marple found herself in the small, quiet parlour of Hillside Cottage, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her mind sifting through the facts. Once again the kettle whistled softly on the stove, and she poured herself a cup of tea. She took her time, letting the warmth settle in her hands as she thought. The murder of Arthur Banbury, the terrible mix of haughtiness, fear, and the desire to hide the past, was what Miss Marple dwelt about. When Elizabeth attempted to conceal her secret, she unwittingly invited Wyford into a world of shadows. Claire, too, was caught up in the chaos, her own complicated past with Arthur Banbury adding layers of mystery. But there was one thing that Miss Marple didn't mention at the time, a small detail that had been there all along: the broken cufflink, the one found in the pantry where Arthur's blood had spilled. The theory that Eliza had planted it was reasonable, but there was something else she hadn't noticed. The cufflink had an unusual pattern of wear that didn't simply correspond to the force of a fall. It matched the wear of someone who had known what it was like to struggle for control. And that was when the final truth dawned: Eliza had been caught in a moment of panic. True, but there had been something else going on. In Miss Marple's mind, the silver lily brooch that Wyford wore that night, the one she had concealed with such care, was more than a charm. It was a statement, a sign of something sinister. It was Wyford who had made the terrible decision. On that fateful night, Liza made her way to the pantry. However, it was Wyford who provided the final push. She had known Arthur Banbury would never stop, and when she saw him fall, she acted. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood and walked to the small window of her cottage. Outside, the rain had stopped, the sky had cleared, and the only smell was that of earth and grass. The village was peaceful, but there was a lesson beneath the tranquility. People could hide their secrets for years, and their transgressions could be covered up by acts of kindness and politeness. However, the truth would eventually emerge, even in the tiniest details. Like the way a woman folded her apron, the pattern of a cufflink, or a slight tremor in a voice. In a community like St. Mildred's, where everything seemed flawlessly organized, the truth was often left in the cracks, and it was in those cracks where the darkness lay. Miss Marple took a long breath, having solved the case. Now the real job would begin. The weight of everything, the missing pieces of the puzzle that had almost escaped Miss Marple's grasp, rested on a simple note to Constable Reeves, which she returned to the table to deliver. With steady hands, she placed the note in the envelope, sealed it, and addressed it to be delivered before dawn. Her voice carried a quiet certainty as she spoke. The mystery of Arthur Banbury had been solved, but the village would never be the same, and so with the passing of another quiet evening in St. Mildred's, the echoes of the past faded into the shadows, leaving behind only the soft hum of life continuing, always changing, always hiding something beneath the surface in Chapter 11. The fog returned on Friday morning, casting a thick blanket over St. Mildred's, as if attempting to mask the residual unease from the previous week. The village became noticeably quieter as the revelation regarding Arthur Banbury's death weighed heavily on everyone's shoulders. With the trial set, gossip faded into the background, and a subtle resignation took its place. Cottage on a slope, as the mist coiled around the trees, Miss Marple stood by the window, her thoughts still racing with the details of the case. Eliza Blackwood's arrest had been quick, as expected, but it had left the villagers with an unsettling feeling that something significant had changed. Part of Miss Marple still couldn't let go of what had happened. The truth had been revealed, but with it came a plethora of unanswered questions. Despite her pride in understanding human nature and seeing clues for what they were, there were moments when even she felt the cost of truth was too high. Eventually, she had to face the reality that Eliza had been consumed by fear. A fear so strong that it had impaired her judgment and caused her to make an ear, the necklace, the abrupt vanishing everything had been too meticulously planned, including the carefully constructed lies. Winifred had hoped that by keeping her past hidden, she could avoid the consequences of her actions, but her guilt had become intertwined with the secrets of the village. The ripple effect of their decisions affected everyone in St. Mildred's, revealing long-hidden divisions. As Miss Marple cautiously made her way to answer the door, the ring of the bell interrupted her reverie. She was taken aback by the sudden appearance of the vice-rever, Reverend Hartnell, who stood on the porch. Hartnell's demeanour was one of extreme weariness, and he handed over a letter to Miss Marple with a solemn look on his face. Regarding Eliza's revelation, I was hoping we might have a conversation. Absolutely, Reverend. I'll accompany you inside for tea. I could feel the seriousness in his voice as I accepted the letter. Thank you, but the focus is on the future, not the case. As he slumped into the chair, Miss Marple's perceptive eyes studied him. It seemed like more than just the case weighed on his mind. He'd been chatting with the constables and the court-appointed attorneys, and now it appears Eliza's fate is sealed. She'll be tried for murder, and rightfully so. But I can't help but feel like there's more to this story, something no one is ready to admit. With an arched eyebrow, Miss Marple set the letter on the table. The village, she asked. We have our culprit and the truth, but what if there's more? What if we've all been hiding something, not just Eliza? Miss Marple looked around the room as if the walls were listening. Everyone has been so fast to accept that everything is in order. Miss Marple sat down opposite him, folding her hands in her lap. You believe the village is complicit in something I don't know, but there's something in the way people are acting. Like they're relieved it's over, but they shouldn't be, should they? There's been a life. Lost a man who had more enemies than anyone knew, and now we'll bury it all. Eliza will go to trial. Winifred will fade into obscurity, and the rest of us will. Pretend nothing happened, but he hesitated, looking down at his hands. What if we're all part of the web that made Arthur Banbury's death inevitable, Saints? Marple was quiet for a long moment, allowing the gravity of his words to settle between them. She had thought of that, of course, the way the village's secrets had twisted themselves around. Arthur's death, the gossip, the lies, the carefully curated facades, but she had believed that the truth had been brought to light. Now she wasn't so sure. Perhaps, Miss Marple said finally, we all are in some way, but the question is not whether we're all complicit. Reverend, it's what we do once we know the truth. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, Miss Marple saw the deep burden of his own conscience. Reflected there, I thought justice hasn't brought relief, he whispered. Now I have more questions than answers. How can we move on from this? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her expression a mix of sadness and knowledge. Reverend, we don't move on. We simply learn to live with the consequences. She paused, letting her words linger in the air. The village would continue, yes. Life would go on as usual, but now it would be different. The shadows that had passed through St. Mildred's were too long to ignore. The vice president nodded slowly, a hint of resignation showing in his features. Miss Marple gently replied, I see your point, but it doesn't make it any easier. It never does. The conversation then refocused on the case, its remaining details, and the unspoken truths that needed to be resolved. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that, even with justice served, there would be something unsaid, and the village and herself would never be the same. The price of truth was high, but it was a price that Miss Marple was willing to pay.